The European Union eases sanctions against Zimbabwe, a reward for progress over political reforms. But some are accusing the EU of putting economic interests ahead of human rights. This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Mike Hanna. Welcome to the program. The European Union has lifted travel and banking restrictions against a number of members of Robert Mugabe's Zanu PF party. It's seen as further encouragement for a country preparing for what's hoped to be free and fair elections. But the measure is being roundly criticised for different reasons. Zanu PF has dismissed it as outrageous and preposterous, arguing that the sanctions are illegal anyway. And rights groups are worried about a deal done over Zimbabwe's diamond mines, which they say help keep Robert Mugabe in power. Haru Mutasa has this report for Inside Story from Harare.
Officials in Zimbabwe are not happy, and this is how they've reacted. Here is a newspaper headline in the capital here in Harare. It reads, Zimbabwe scoffs at EU visa ban deal. Basically, officials here had hoped for more. In particular, they wanted a certain company, the Zimbabwe Minerals Development Corporation, to be delisted. This company sells minerals all over the world, minerals like gold and diamonds, for example, but they cannot operate in EU member states. And the government is saying that it has to sell its diamonds, for example, at below market value prices because of this. Now, EU member states or officials say that the only reason they're not going to remove sanctions altogether is because they're concerned any money generated from the sale of these diamonds, for example, will go towards funding violent activities in Zimbabwe. The country will have a referendum on a draft constitution on the 16th of March, and then people will vote in a presidential election in July. Now, the diplomatic community and human rights activists say that they're worried that acts of violence and intimidation are on the rise as people are being beaten and arrested for speaking out against the establishment, for example. Now, the Zimbabwean authorities say this is not true. They're denying this. They say they need the money to build infrastructure in the country. And right now, the general sentiment, at least from certain officials who are still on that list, is that they aren't happy with the fact that the EU has only decided to ease the sanctions of a few individuals and not remove them altogether. Haru Mutasa reporting for Inside Story.
Well, let me bring in our guests. Joining us from Harare is Tafatswa Musarara, chairman of Resources Exploitation Watch, an NGO which backs Zanu PF. In Johannesburg, Tseke Kasambala, advocacy director of the African division of Human Rights Watch. And completing our panel, Daniel Hammett, a lecturer on human geography at the University of Sheffield, and joining us from Leeds. Welcome to you all. But first, before discussion, a little bit of background. Economic hardship and a series of disputed elections have been at the root of much of Zimbabwe's troubles. Simmering frustrations boiled over in late 2006 as inflation exceeded 1,000%. Public demonstrations were quickly banned. Opposition leader Morgan Tsvangirai was arrested and badly beaten at a rally in March the following year. Elections were then held in March 2008. Robert Mugabe was declared the winner in polls marred by allegations of ballot rigging and voting intimidation. An uneasy power-sharing deal was forged in September 2008, with Tsvangirai later sworn in as Prime Minister. In June of 2009, a review of the constitution began. Little progress was made. But talks resumed this year, and now March the 16th has been set as a date for a referendum on a new constitution. This is seen as a key reform ahead of elections scheduled for July. Well, let's begin with Tseke Kasambala. Do you think that what we are hearing here constitutes enough reform for these sanctions to be lifted?
No, we don't believe that there have been enough reforms in Zimbabwe to allow for, A, the easing of sanctions or restrictive measures by the European Union. The reforms that have taken place to date are what we think what we term as purely cosmetic types of reforms. Arrests and beatings continue in Zimbabwe. Earlier today, we saw the offices of the Zimbabwe Election Support Network raided by the police under the pretext of looking for employees who did not have work permits. And we have seen similar raids on other civil society organizations in the past 6 months. The conditions have not improved at all.
Well, Tafatswa Masarara in Harare, you have consistently opposed sanctions. What's your reaction to the partial lifting of them?
Well, the partial lifting of sanctions itself is a non-event in the sense that it does not address the concerns of all parties. The global political agreement is very clear that the sanctions must go. All the three parties, the former warring parties, have agreed that sanctions must be lifted. These sanctions are illegal. Illegal in the sense that the people who imposed or who were put on these restrictive sanctions or institutions that were also listed on these sanctions were never afforded procedural rights. Procedural rights relates to affording the accused the right of reply to whatever allegations you are making against him. If Robert Mugabe today is going to do the same to opposition just to detain them without trial, definitely the likes of my sister Kasambala and even EU itself are going to raise concerns that people must be put through due process in terms of any punishment, in terms of any retributive measures. Now, in Zimbabwe, we have seen the EU itself putting sanctions on the people that it never told what wrong they have done. They've frozen the assets of some of the key institutions, for instance, the Grain Marketing Board, ZMDC, ZB Bank, which are very key in terms of the country's national economic activities. So really, you also notice that the partial lifting itself is meant to cause division within the Zanu PF party. They have delisted one Webster Shamu, who is number 5 in terms of the Zanu PF ranking. They have delisted Walter Mzembe and Nguni.
Well, let me,
now,
if I may just interrupt at that point, Tafatswa, I just want to go to Daniel Hammett on the wider issue that you were bringing up here. The very strong argument that sanctions should never have been imposed in the first place and that the partial lifting of sanctions represents a travesty. What is your view on that wider point?
I think there's two issues here. One is the role of and the kind of benefits accruing from sanctions as a tool to encourage democratization around the world. The second is specific relation to Zimbabwe. And if we focus on the relationship to Zimbabwe and the role of the targeted sanctions used against leaders of Zanu PF and others, organisations identified as being complicit in the abuse of human rights and the suppression of free and fair elections, that's a very strategic targeting of sanctions, not against the Zimbabwean people as a whole, but against strategic targets to try and encourage, try and move towards a system of participatory democracy and trying to find ways of addressing the human rights abuses and things that have gone on to date. I mean, that's the key role of the sanctions. Whether or not they were imposed, the imposition as a travesty, I would disagree with. Sanctions are an important part of international diplomacy. They're an important part of international due process in trying to tackle events and situations that go against the norms of what we would expect as a global society in terms of things like human rights abuses, democratization and free, open public spheres for citizen participation. So I don't see them as being a travesty at all. The outcomes of sanctions are not always as intended, but certainly the intention behind the sanctions were to encourage a return to the strong roots of democracy that existed in Zimbabwe at one time.
Well, Tafatswa Masarara, I see you shaking your head there, but I want to pick up on that point that you began to make, arguing that this partial lifting of sanctions is in fact an attempt to divide politicians within Zimbabwe by singling out particular individuals on whom the sanctions are lifted and not on others. Explain more.
You see, what is happening is that you are delisting people whom we have put on the list, the 19 people, but I want to focus on the ministers themselves. You ask your question, what have they done now which they were not doing at the time of the listing on sanctions? Then the other issue also is to say these people have been, as a collective, accused of human rights violation. Now, you take 6 ministers out. What is the implication? Are you saying these are now pliant to EU's interest, or but they still remain part of Zanu PF? The other issue is that there have never been any success in terms of making sure that these sanctions are targeted. none of the people listed on the sanctions have died of hunger or HIV or some of the poverty-driven vices. Now, the people who have been affected are the majority of Zimbabweans, because the key institutions which are meant to provide them with the key services are under EU sanctions. The other also issue that I want to talk now is the ZMDC.
Well, if I may once again interrupt you there, Tafatswa, we will pick up on that particular issue, but I just want to go to Seki Kasambala at this particular point and raise the issue, continue the discussion which has been brought up here, the selective imposition of sanctions, the naming of particular individuals. Does this, in effect, work, or does it create the possibility that you do have this argument advanced that the attempt is now being made to divide the Zimbabwean leadership?
Well, I think let's look back to the reasons why these restrictive measures or sanctions came into place in Zimbabwe between 2000 and 2002. I think it was 2002. One of the reasons was to ensure that people who had been complicit in abuses on the ground and entities that had helped in this type of complicity in abuses were isolated from the international community, in particular from the European Union. When you talk about entities like the Grain and Marketing Board, our own researchers at Human Rights Watch shows that organizations such as the Grain and Marketing Board and ZMTC, which we will talk about later, have been used by Zanu PF and certain people on the list, that sanctions list, A, to enrich themselves, B, these entities have not been used to benefit the majority of the people. The Grain and Marketing Board, for example, was a highly politicized and is a highly politicized body. In advance of elections, every time elections are about to take place in Zimbabwe, the Grain and Marketing Board plays a role in ensuring those who are perceived to support the opposition do not benefit from the food aid or the grain that is available at the time, in terms of agricultural instruments, etc. There's a lot of politicization of the agricultural industry in Zimbabwe, in particular ahead of elections. So to argue that these entities are just simply there is wrong. These entities are there because they are complicit in the general poor human rights situation in Zimbabwe.
Well, we'll continue with that in a moment, but we've got to take a look at exactly what we are talking about here. The EU imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe in 2002 in protest at human rights abuses and violations of democracy under Robert Mugabe's rule. 112 individuals were blacklisted, including Robert Mugabe and more than 20 members of his cabinet. 11 companies were also targeted, including those associated with Zimbabwe's Marangi diamond fields. EU foreign ministers have now lifted travel and banking bans on 21 government loyalists and a company named as Divine Home Limited. And a deal has been reached to ease more sanctions within a month of elections if the polls are seen as peaceful, transparent and credible. But in particular, it specified that sanctions would be lifted on the Zimbabwe Mining Development Corporation, something which has been urged by Belgium in particular within the EU, and which profits greatly from the diamonds produced in these mines. But Daniel Hammett, are we seeing here in all of this an example of possible profit before principles?
That's very well put. I think as far as the Belgian government's stance on this goes, it would appear that from the first viewing of it to be very much driven by the importance of the diamond industry to Belgium and to Antwerp in particular. And their interest very much is opening back up markets for accessing diamonds for the wholesale. And that is kind of very much juxtaposed against the rest of Europe's more concerned approach towards Zimbabwe and desire to retain sanctions and to oppose the lifting of sanctions in many ways. So in that sense, yes, I suppose it is profits above principles.
Well, Tafatswa Masarara, if we do take this point, it would appear to undermine the integrity of sanctions in the first place. If they can be partially lifted, if the issue of profit by those imposing the sanctions comes into the debate, then surely that undermines the whole concept of sanctions completely. Your view?
No, there was no need for imposition of sanctions by European Union. I think as a matter of background, you appreciate that some time ago, the EU, together with their allies, America, put Zimbabwe on the United Nations security agenda, trying to put or to attract UN sanctions on Zimbabwe. And that was vetoed by China and Russia. When they, after that embarrassment, they came back to make sure that they come up with their own concoction to impose sanctions on Zimbabwe. Now, if we look at ZMDC, for instance, EU is the chair of the working group on monitoring within the Kimberley Process. And as you are aware, the European Union has voted in favor of the certification of the 4 mines in Marange, which are Mbada, Anjin, DMC, and Marange resources. Now, for them to say on another fora, we are opposed to the trade of diamonds, surely it exposes the confusion within the European Union. The other issue also EU has to notice is that whilst they are trying to play a master on the Zimbabwe diamonds, the Asia itself, you are working in a giant in Surat and Dubai. Belgium, at this rate, will be no more. Antwerp will be wiped out at the current rate, given that Dubai and Surat's growth now is indexed on the Marange diamonds. So if they wanted to have Zimbabwe for lunch, I'm sure the issue, the developments in Asia, will have EU for breakfast.
Well, Tseki Kasambala, your view of this, the whole question of profit playing a role in deciding about sanctions and whether, in fact, it does undercut the reason for imposing them in the first place.
Yes, indeed. And I think, as Mr. Musarara himself has talked about the Kimberley Process, which is the main diamond certification scheme, we believe that the Kimberley Process's credibility has been undermined by the way it has dealt with the situation in Zimbabwe. Let's not forget that up to 100 local artisanal miners lost their lives way back in 2008 after the Zimbabwean army went in and shot them and killed them. There has been no accountability for those abuses. Let's not forget the lack of transparency by some of the companies that are operating in the Marange diamond fields, such as Mbada, and organizations such as Global Witness, Partnership Africa, Canada, and ourselves have documented some of the issues around transparency and human rights abuses. So it's a shame that the member states that are composed of the Kimberley Process have undermined their own credibility by certifying and allowing diamonds from these companies to be exported. At the same time, the EU, especially Belgium, own cynical attempt of, as you put it, putting profit before power is quite shameful, to be quite honest. And this is why we're saying that this whole idea of a gradual easing of restrictive measures just doesn't hold water. These restrictive measures should have remained in place until there were wholesale reforms on the ground in Zimbabwe, until the situation in Marange had been adequately dealt with and abuses and accountability issues had been addressed there. And we felt that these restrictive measures should have remained in place wholesale until the next review in February 2014.
Well, let's at this point just take a closer look at Robert Mugabe, who's been the dominant figure in Zimbabwean politics. He made his name in the 1970s as a guerrilla leader fighting white minority rule. And in 1980, he was elected Prime Minister, but he was accused of failing to honour his promises of unity and democracy. His decision to force through land seizures in 2000 proved economically disastrous. Critics maintain the farms taken from white owners were handed to political cronies. The economy went into freefall, sowing the seeds for much of the current discontent. Daniel Hammett in Leeds, we're looking at these sanctions in being applied selectively or targeted, as you put it, and yet you do have what critics would argue is the prime mover behind the crisis in Zimbabwe, largely unaffected. There's a selectivity here, is there not?
There is, and the decisions behind exactly who is targeted were made, I guess, in consultation and negotiation behind closed doors often, I suppose. The specific way in which they've played out, you could question whether or not the lifting of sanctions against specific leaders are efforts to allow them and enable a greater dialogue and negotiation, to allow certain more senior figures to attend international meetings, to attend negotiations about resolving the growing crisis in Zimbabwe at the time. Another part of that is, even if you bring in selected sanctions against specific targets, there are specific cases where they're not going to work as effectively because of the ways in which individuals will use their own access to resources to circumvent those international constraints.
Well, all of this has provoked some strong reaction on Al Jazeera's Facebook page. Abshir Osman says, "I think Zimbabwe has suffered enough from the sanctions. It's time these sanctions be lifted and let the people restore their shattered lives." Carlos Chuck says, "Easing the sanctions is not the only issue here, but the EU should also step up in providing a level playing field in the coming election." John Tyrrell says, "No one should ease sanctions on Mugabe until he and his ilk are gone from power." And Tamsankwa Kokolo says, "It's time they stop these sanctions because it affects the ordinary man in the street." Tavadzwa Masarara, you mentioned this point before, that sanctions impact on the person in the street?
True, the sanctions itself, they heighten polarization between political actors in this country. There is other political actors who accuse the others for inviting sanctions. And again, where you are trying to seek peace, to seek normalcy, you won't be able to achieve that when the other one feel that the operating political environment has been to a large extent affected by sanctions. The other issue also I want to talk about the human rights in Marange. I think the civil society scripts or books or reports on Marange makes Steven Spielberg grow green with envy because of the fiction in it. Up now, there's no civic organization that have given a list of the people that were killed in Marange. The other issue is that when these sanctions were imposed, it was a reaction to the Zanu PF's land reform program. And I quote that the reason given was that Zimbabwe must restore property rights, especially over land, because most of the white commercial farmers have lost their land. At that time, there was no Marange to talk about. But year in, year out, they continue to come up with new measures, new benchmarks for Zanu PF to meet. But we all know that the biggest issue here is that they would want a regime change in Zimbabwe.
Well, let me go at this particular point because we are running out of time. If I may, Tavadzwa, if we could just go to Tseki Kasambala and put that particular point, the argument that what is being attempted through sanctions, through criticism of the human rights record is regime change. What's your response to that?
This is not about regime change. This is about what Robert Mugabe and his party, Zanu PF, have done to the people of Zimbabwe. The argument that the sanctions have hurt the people of Zimbabwe doesn't hold water because we know it's the direct policies of Robert Mugabe and Zanu PF that led to some of the humanitarian crisis that we have seen since this political crisis began in 2000. Let's not forget that it's Robert Mugabe's party who single-handedly evicted and destroyed the businesses of up to 1 million people in Harare and other parts of the country, many of them who were suffering from HIV and AIDS and ended up losing their ARV treatments. Let's not forget it's the land reform program which led to some of the shortages of food in Zimbabwe soon after that. And then, I mean, the list goes on. So, and when we come to Marange and the fact that what we have written is fiction, I visited the morgues. I saw some of the bodies which had been put there under the pretext of having died from cholera, which had bullet wounds. We visited the mass graves where some of these local artisanal miners had been buried.
Well, these are very specific things that we don't want to get into at this particular point, but I do want to go to Daniel Hammett very quickly indeed and ask whether free and fair elections will constitute proper reform.
They will constitute the start of a process of reform where the institutions of civil society are allowed to be rebuilt, where media freedoms are reintroduced, and where there's a broader and much more holistic approach to the entrenchment of democracy in Zimbabwe. So free and fair elections are a critical but not sufficient first step in that process.
Well, at that point, thank you to all my guests, Tavadzwa Musarara, Tseki Kasambala, and Daniel Hammett. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Don't forget, you can find this program and many others on our website, aljazeera.com. Just follow the links and you can leave your comments there. Thanks again for watching. I'm Mike Hanna. Goodbye for now.